Hello, and thank you for being part of the Jewish Federation's Community Mitzvah Month and Keeping the Stories Alive, brought to you by the Holocaust Council of Greater Metro West, a department of Federation. My name is Debbie Kaplan, and I am the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors Millie and Abraham Zuckerman, of blessed memory. My grandfather, who I called Zaida, was a Schindler Jew who passed away 7.5 years ago, and my grandmother, who I called Baba, passed away this August. Both of their stories of survival during the Holocaust were truly remarkable and helped to shape the lives that they would go on to lead here in the United States. My entire family was truly blessed to have them so close by. Their impact upon us was to be positive, live a Jewish life, and to give others was so evident in all they did. As a parent of 2 young adult daughters, I feel so fortunate that they were able to learn from my Baba and Zaida firsthand. Now that they are gone, it is not just our obligation, but truly a privilege to continue to tell their stories. The Holocaust was an event that should never be forgotten, and it is our job to ensure that these stories are shared within our community and further on. I'm deeply grateful for the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West is so committed and devoted to doing this. Just that, though, the program's Life Keeping the Stories Alive and Survivor Speaks, programmed by the Holocaust Counselor. Together at events like this, I know that all of us can make a greater impact, and for that, I thank you. I am honored today to introduce the Director of Holocaust Education and Newark Initiatives, Elise Shane-Brown.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for sharing those beautiful words with us. Having had the honor and pleasure of meeting your grandparents on several occasions, I'm sure that they are so proud of all you are doing to continue on with their legacy. And having said that, I would like to introduce 2 teenagers on with us today who would like to share a few words with each of you about how important they feel Holocaust education is. Lila and Jesse, I will turn the program over to you.
Hi, everyone. So while most people learn history through textbooks, today we have the opportunity to hear firsthand testimony of history with immeasurable value. It is crucial that we preserve the experiences of Holocaust survivors to pass on to future generations who will not have this incredibly valuable opportunity to hear from them.
Thank you, Lila. So my name is Jesse Coppell. As the grandson of a Holocaust survivor, it is so important to me to listen to the stories of those who survived the horrors of the Holocaust to make sure that we continue their legacy of never forgetting. As the last generation to be able to hear live, firsthand accounts of the Holocaust, it is more important than ever that we all become witnesses as well. Thank you so much to the Holocaust Council of the Greater Metro West area for giving us a special opportunity.
Thank you both so much. And as we listen today, I want each of you to remember how honored and privileged you should be to be able to meet with a Holocaust survivor. As we know, the Holocaust ended almost 76 years ago in May, and time is marching on. And while I pray every single day that our survivors are with us for many, many, many years to come, we know that that is not necessarily a reality. So what is going to happen is it's going to be your job, each of you here today, to continue to pass on these stories, to hear as many of them as you're able to, and to continue to tell them for years and years to come. So with that, I ask that each of you do me a favor, and we're a nice group, intimate group on purpose to be able to have a conversation. I want each of you to think about one person that you can speak to, socially distanced, of course, I know you've gotten used to that, you can speak to in the next 24 hours. And please share the story you hear today from Norbert Bakalish. Tell that person this story. And then in addition to all of you hearing it, at least one more person will know and hear and be able to share this story. So with that, I'm going to introduce Norbert. I'm going to ask him some questions so that he can tell his story. At any point, if you have a question, please put it in the chat and I will ask Norbert that question. He likes the interaction and wants to hear from each of you. So please make sure to think of questions and put them there. So I'm going to introduce Norbert to you. Hi, Norbert. And
Hi.
thank you so much for joining us today, as we know how important it is for all of us to continue to hear these stories of survival from the Holocaust. So the first question I'm going to ask you is, you can introduce yourself and share a little bit about your childhood before the Nazis came to power.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm certainly pleased to be here and to talk to particularly the younger generation, the youngest generation, to learn about these events, which unfortunately are historical and but are very much part of the life of a survivor. I was born in Berlin, Germany, 92 years ago, and and I have, so I remember, even as a child, I remember a lot of things that happened then. And not 92 years ago, but the subsequent years and, that we're going to hear about. Hitler coming to power was when I was very young. It was 1933, and I was 4 years old. I do remember hearing about it, but I had no idea what this meant, or certainly had no idea what was to follow. So that's, I think I've answered your question.
So can you tell us, you were only 4 years old and you lived, I know you lived in Germany. Can you tell us where in Germany?
I was born and lived in Berlin, the capital of Germany, and my parents, and my father actually had served not in the German army, but in the First World War in the Austrian army, which was an ally of Germany. He had a whole bunch of decorations. So he was a veteran, a decorated war veteran.
So that the teens understand, your parents, while they were Jewish, they were also fully German.
Well, we were German. It turns out we were not German. My parents came from Galicia, and that at the time was Austrian. So my father served in the Austrian army, but the excuse me, but the Austrians were allies of the Germans.
And you had any siblings? Did you have any siblings?
I had a brother who was 8 years older.
Brother that was 8 years older. So
Yeah.
then when
You're going to hear about him.
As Jews living under Hitler's regime and Nazi control, what was your life like?
Well, I can tell you this. We lived in a part of Berlin called Neukölln, and there were very few Jews living there. Very, very few Jews. In fact, in our house, there weren't any. And so it was essentially a non-Jewish neighborhood. So all the events that took place were outside events, but we attended a synagogue. We could walk to the synagogue. It was a long walk, but we could go to a synagogue, and we were members of a synagogue.
And how soon were there restrictions put on your lives as Jews?
I can tell you this. I started school at age 6, and I was treated with great respect by the teacher. The teacher made I cannot remember a single anti-Semitic incident. And he was nice. And the kids in the class who were my age knew I was Jewish, for one reason being that that they had religious instruction. And for religious instruction, the teacher told me, Norbert, you can sit in the back, you don't have to listen to this. But actually, until 1938, when I was 9 years old. There's very little to say. I really, I heard how the radio, of course, was, there was no television in those days, so the radio, we're listening to it, it was always full of denunciation, how terrible the Jews were to Germany and how all the bad things that had happened to Germany were the fault of Jews. But in my immediate neighborhood, I played with the other kids who lived in the building. And when something happened, they said, "Oh, you're Jewish," and so that's we can't expect that. But they really, I did not really feel anything bad until later. We'll certainly talk about that.
Right, so that's my next question. So it started to shift around 1937, 1938. And what happened particularly that made your family feel anxious, nervous, scared about being Jewish in Germany?
What happened was during the night of the 28th to 29th of October in 1938, when I was 9 years old, the Nazi police came in the middle of the night to wake us up, and they took away both my father and my brother, who was 8 years older. And we had no idea what had happened to them. We knew it wasn't good, but they came in the middle of the night and arrested them and took them away.
And you were left alone with your mother?
With my mother, yes. We were only two children, so, and my brother was 8 years old, as I said, so I was 9 at the time, he was 17.
And that was before Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass?
It was before. It was before, yes.
Almost directly before. If those of you that don't know, the Night of Broken Glass on November 9th happened throughout Germany and Austria, where there was destruction to Jewish properties, synagogues, businesses throughout the entire area by the Nazis. So now you're alone with your mother, your father, and your brother are arrested and taken away. And what happens next?
Okay. What happened next was that we had no idea where they were, but we then received word that they had been deported to Poland, which was still an independent country then. It was not occupied by the Germans. But because my father had been born in Austria, in Galicia, which was part of Austria at the time, as I said before, Austria, he'd served in the army, but that part of what became Poland after the First World War. And so we were actually Polish citizens. And so during that night of 28th of October, they arrested all men over the age of, I believe, 17 or 18, or 16, because my brother was arrested at 17, and deported them to Poland. Now, Poland said, they're not ours, they don't live here. They shipped them back. And Poland was still independent. And the Germans then took the train and pushed it back into Poland, and the Poles pushed it back into Germany. And this went on for a while, till finally this made news everywhere, and the Polish Jewish community decided, we will take them, let them in, and we will take care of them. So that was, so they were in Poland. They were in Poland.
And so then, did they come back? Did you see them again at that point?
Okay. My father, but not my brother, was after a while was allowed to come back for a short time. I don't remember exactly how long it was. It was, I think, 6 weeks or something like this. The idea was for us to, what they called, liquidate all of our belongings, which meant having to get rid of them in a hurry at a ridiculous price. And we had to do that. I had an uncle in Brooklyn, and he wrote to us, said, I will send it to us. I will take care of it. So we got what they called a lift, which is a container, and all of our furniture was moved into it, and our belongings were moved into it, and that was shipped to America. That was in 1939. By that time it was 1939. When my father was allowed to return. It must have been May 39. He was deported, as I said, the end of October, but was allowed to come back for a short period of time on one condition, by the way,
Yeah,
that we got rid of everything and that we are out by a given date. Now, my parents, and especially my mother, they were both born in what had been Austrian part of Austria, but was then part of Poland. And my mother just didn't like the idea of Poland at all. And so she, when we got orders to leave, she contacted the Jewish community and found out that there was what they called a Kindertransport, convoys of children going to countries outside of Germany. And my mother and my father signed me up for that. But before I left on the Kindertransport, which happened, I had to go, our time was up, and we had to leave Germany, but I didn't leave Germany because my Kindertransport wasn't ready yet. But my parents had to go, and there was no place for them to go but Poland. So I went to the railroad station in Berlin, and
I'm sorry, just remind everybody, how old are you at this point?
9 years old.
Okay.
No,
So you go to the railroad station.
no, I was 10 years old.
Okay.
I was 10 years old, 1939 that was. By that time I was 39. And went to the railroad station. They went on the train. In those days, the windows could be pulled down and inside of the train. You know, the windows could open those. Now they don't do that anymore, but in those days you could. So they opened the window of where they were seated and stood by the window, and they tried very hard not to cry and to make a scene, because they didn't want me to make a scene either. So the train started to go, and I ran on the platform alongside the train, waving to them, and they were waving to me. They looked very, very sad, both of them. And that was absolutely the last time I saw my parents.
That must have been, as a 10-year-old boy, so difficult for you and so difficult for your parents, knowing that they may never see you again.
Well, they knew that
Courage to be able to have done that.
But they hoped that I would be safe going on a Kindertransport outside of Germany.
So then how do you eventually get on that Kindertransport? Because now you're 10 years old and you're alone in Berlin.
Some things, no, I wasn't alone, because it turns out that my father had a sister who also lived in Berlin, and her husband had also been deported. But he was allowed to come back later than my father, and so I could stay with them because they did not have to leave yet. So I stayed with them until it was time for me to leave.
And then what happens when they take you to the train and where for the kinder transport? And now the war has not officially started yet. And where are you able to go?
Well, in the meantime, I should say that a few days after my father and brother were deported was Kristallnacht. No, let me describe two major events that happened before I left left on the kinder transport. In November, as I said, my father and my brother were deported at the end of October, but in November, all Germany erupted into this violent attacks on Jews all over Germany, which is known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. And so that happened then. A few days later, my teacher, who, as I told you, was very nice, to me. He was nice to everybody, including to me. He did not do anything special for me or against me. My teacher said, I have to go to the principal. But when the teacher sends you to the principal, it's rarely for a good reason. So I went to the principal and I came in, and the principal was sitting behind his desk, very formally, bureaucratically. And he barely looked at me and said, Norbert, you have to go home. So I said, what? Why do I have to go home? He was sort of surprised by my question, because in Germany, when the official gives you an order, you follow it. And here I was questioning why. So I said, why? And he said, just go home. And I said, well, am I not a good student? So he sort of got a little nervous. He was not used to being questioned. He said, yes, you were a good student. You're a good student. You were a good student. Then I said, well, have I done anything bad? He said, no, you haven't done anything bad. And so then he just said, Norbert, go home. So I said, well, if I didn't do anything bad and I'm a good student, why do I have to go home? So he barely in a whisper, didn't look at me, looked down, because he didn't have the courage to look at me. He said, because you're Jewish. And then he pleaded with me, just go home. Please don't make a fuss, just go home and don't come back. So I was expelled from school also, and Kristallnacht took place. And so my mother, as I said, then got very busy with the Jewish community, trying to find a safe place for me.
So what happens after that? She finds you get your parents have now left. You have the opportunity to get on a kinder transport. And where do you end up going?
Well, I went to the railroad station with my aunt and my uncle, because, as I said, my uncle had also been deported, but he was allowed to come back a little later than my father, so he was still in Berlin. So they brought me there. All the other kids who were in the kinder transport, we were about 40 on this convoy, and they all had to say goodbye to their parents, and it was a very, very emotional scene at the railroad station. But then we left, and I remember when we entered France, most of the kinder transports ended up in England, but our kinder transport went to France. When it crossed the border out of Germany, we all let out a big yell, hooray! We were just delighted. We're out of Germany at last. And we arrived in Paris, and we were taken care of by a French count. He was financing it. By the way, a French count and a and the niece of the last Russian Tsar, who was a big anti-Semite and had all these pogroms, his niece was also, they were financing the group of 40 outside in they're taking over a little house in Paris, outside of Paris and in the suburbs. And that's where they put us. But a Jewish organization called OSE, which are the two letters for the three words, Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, means Children's Welfare Organization in French, took care of us. And we were, as I said, we were financed by the French Count and the Russian princess. Called her the princess.
And so a lot of people helped you. Now you're in France, and at this point, France is free. They're not at war. So
That's
what
right.
happens to change things
Well, what
after the
happened-
war begins?
Yeah, but let me say something first before the war began. No, actually, this was after the war began, right after the war began. The school started. And what happens to the 40 boys who were in that house outside in that town outside of Paris? Are they going to go to school? Well, it turns out that most of them did not know French. Well, all of them, all but I, and I think one other boy, did not know enough French to go to a French school. So they stayed in there, but I was allowed to start school. And in fact, I knew no French at all. And so what they did was to put us several grades below, about 2 grades below, figuring that I would know the subject matter and would learn the French as it was being taught. After a while, they moved me up to 1 year behind, based on age, 1 year behind. And then subsequently, I was put in with the kids my own age. And at the end of the year, I got the commendation from the school for the good work I had done. So I'd learned
Because even though
French.
you didn't speak French, you were so bright, you can figure it all out, right, Norbert?
Yeah, well, I had to learn French in a hurry, and I did. So that was it until the German invasion started. When then the Germans attacked, well, the war started in September. We had arrived on the 7th of July. 7th of July in 1939. On the 1st of September, the war started. But in the beginning, nothing much happened except there were bombings all around our area because there was a military airport not far away from where we were living. So there were bombings there, but we were not really affected by it. Not really affected until the Germans invaded France and the French army just collapsed. I mean, this was in the First World War. For 4 years, they had fought the Germans the Germans could never get into Paris. We tried to run away from the Germans, but so did all of France. The roads were jammed with people trying to run away from the Germans. But then we heard that Paris had been taken. And on the First World War, the Germans had made 2 major offensives trying to take Paris and never succeeded. But now they had. So we went back to our house and we found, we had tried to walk away. The French woman who was in charge of us had asked an officer, a French officer, said, "Can't you provide transportation for our children to get away from here?" He said, "Yes, we'll send a truck. Just stay here." Well, we stayed and we stayed and we stayed, and the truck never came. So we finally, the Germans, I remember the first German arriving that I hadn't seen until since I had left Germany. The German soldier came in and searched the building where we were and where we were hiding. And anyway, and then everybody, all of France was on the road trying to run away from the Germans. Now they were all running back in the other direction. So we walked back. And actually something truly funny happened on the way back.
Yes.
There are a lot of sad stories, but this one is funny. We get to an intersection and there was a German military policeman making sure that the German traffic gets priority over all the people fleeing or trying to get back home. And as we were walking by, the German policeman, military policeman, looked at the lady who was in charge of us. He said, "Frau Lederer, Mrs. Lederer." And she looked at him. They were neighbors from Vienna. And this was just.
And that's where they met.
And so then we continued to walk. We walked and walked and walked and walked. We got back to our house. We found the German army had occupied it. They saw an empty house that had rooms, so the German occupiers had taken it. And we didn't know what to do. And they didn't know what to do with all those Jewish kids, because this was early we're talking about in 1939. We're talking about June 39. And anyway, we shared the house with the Germans, and something very unusual happened. They decided they were going to take some floors. We were not allowed to go up, and they weren't coming down, so that we would be separated from the Germans. And one day the Germans came down and told us, "It's not your fault, all the things that the Jews did. It's your father's fault, father's plural, And so they decided to behave toward us, because unlike in Poland, the Germans were under strict orders to behave well toward the local population. We were part of a local population, as far as they were concerned. So they behaved nicely with us, and they stayed there for a while, and we stayed there, and we played basketball with them, and we played football, football meaning soccer.
Soccer, yes.
With them, and it was a coexistence, but it wasn't to last.
Right. So then what starts to shift and what happens as the Germans in France start to treat the Jews the way they're treating the Jews in other parts of Europe? What begins to happen?
That didn't happen till much later.
Right. And where do you end up having?
What happened first, that we had to first, when we got orders, we had to leave. We couldn't, this living in the same house with the German army just couldn't last. So we were dispersed in various places. And I and two other boys ended up in an orphanage in Paris. The Jewish orphanage, it's called the Rothschild, was because the Rothschild family paid for it, the Rothschild orphanage in Paris. And that's where I and two other boys ended up. I had no idea where the other boys were, but the other boys found me, and one of the boys there, one of the older boys who had been very friendly to me, started to agitate, because they were in the part. What I didn't say is that the Germans didn't occupy all of France. They only occupied the northern part of France and all along the Atlantic Ocean. So, but all the rest was unoccupied France, and still with the French government. And that's where I found out the other kids were. And he found me in this orphanage, and he talked to people, and then till I got papers for my being able to go to to join them in the unoccupied part of France, which was much safer.
And what happens when you move there? What's the
Well,
next step?
I had a terrible thing happening to me on the train going from one place to the other. There was a demarcation line where north of it, the Germans were, and south of it, the French were still in charge, okay? As we got to the demarcation, the German soldiers came with weapons, came and to see who was on the train, because we were going out of their zone of control into the French zone. And they came in, the Germans came in, and I got absolutely terrified because I had letters from my parents in German. And in panic, I took the letters from my parents and tore them up into little bits and threw them out the window of the train. And I know exactly where that happened at the railroad station and with that town. I have refused to go back to that town. I've been in France. We lived in France for 3 years in the 1980s. And I refused to go through that town. That's one of the worst things, because when the Germans finally came and looked at us, they saw kids sitting there and they said, well, you know, they went on. They paid no attention. And at that point, I really felt bad that I had done that. There was only one good part of that. I was about to tear up the pictures of my parents, because there were some things that, if you look closely, you could tell that this was not France, it was Germany. And when I got to the photographs, I just didn't have the heart to tear them up. And I kept those.
And thankfully you did.
And I was able to keep these photographs. I still have them today.
So then can you tell us, before we ask for questions, can you tell us how you eventually survived and what happened?
Okay. What happened next is when we arrived at the train station, one of the boys whom I knew who had come from Berlin with me on the kinder transport, was there with on a bicycle, and he took our luggage and he said, you just walk behind me and we'll go, I'll show you the way. And he showed us the way to a house in a little town, a village, actually. It's a village. Just a few people lived there, and a few people and a lot of cows lived there. And the town was called Chabannes, Chabannes. And that's at the OSE, that Jewish organization that I mentioned before, the Jewish Children's Welfare Organization, French Jewish organization, had taken over a house there because it was in the unoccupied zone. And there were about 100 kids in that house. There were actually 2 buildings, and we went there. So I found my old friends again. They were there. They had done their bit from their side so that we could get the papers and get permissions and all of this to join them. So we were then in Chabannes. And Chabannes, the story of Chabannes is very interesting, how we were saved there. And it's in a film called The Children of Chabannes, which I think you should see if you can. You can get it from the usual sources. You can rent it. You can Chabannes, Chabannes, and The Children of Chabannes. And it's a long story, but all but some of the boys who were older than 17 were saved. The older boys were arrested by the French and handed over to the Germans for deportation. and all but 2 were murdered. But 2 survived, which we saw after the war.
So you survived the entire time in this town?
Not the entire
Entire
time,
time,
but,
right.
I got there in 1940 and I left in 1943. So I was there about 2.5 or 2 3/4 years.
And the people there helped you and were good to you and the people there helped you?
Yeah, there were Jews in charge of us, and things were good. They picked a few kids again to attend the public school, and I attended the public school, and I was in touch with the teachers. Well, it turns out I don't want to brag, but because it's you know, we're talking about what happened to the Jewish kids. In France, when you graduate from elementary school, you take an exam. And I placed first in the whole region, which was sort of, I forgot to say, we got kicked out of school in France also for the same reason.
So
But
you should brag, because it shows how well you were able to catch up in your studies.
Yeah.
Somebody is actually asking, when did you come to the United States?
Well,
But
there's a lot in between.
Yes,
There's a
I
lot
was going to say,
before.
before we get to that, can you tell us what happened at the end of the war and what happened to your parents and your brother?
Okay, let me briefly summarize. The Germans then occupied the so-called unoccupied zone of France. So now we were again under the Germans. And the Jewish organization, this OSE, sent me to another part of France, which was occupied by the Italian army, because the Italians, unlike the Germans, although they were allies of the Germans, did not persecute the Jews, did not persecute them, or certainly not kill them and hand them over to the Nazis, to the German Nazis. So it was a safe region. It was a safe region. But then Italy surrendered to the Allies, made an armistice with the Allies in September 1943. And the Germans decided to take over the part of France that was occupied by the Italian army. So I was again under the Germans. And so I and 2 boys, we were, the Italian zone was in the Alps, in the French Alps, which bordered Italy and Switzerland. I and 2 other boys then decided we're going to go into Switzerland. And 3 of us walked and walked and walked and walked. We had no idea where we were going, you know, whether we were going in the right direction or not going in the right direction. And we were going and we had no food, we had no water, we had no nothing. Finally, we were utterly exhausted. We saw a road which was going down. We said, well, whatever happens, we're going to take that road. And we did. We walked down and we were stopped by a military patrol, which happened to be Swiss. So the Swiss took us in at this point and didn't know what to do with us because nobody came over the mountains. There were places in Switzerland where Jews were continuously trying to escape to Switzerland. So the police and the army knew what to do with people. With us, they didn't know what to do, so they put us into prison, into jail. And we were there and we were interrogated and finally they released us. And they put us they called it a camp, but it actually was a converted large school. in which we were housed. There were a whole bunch of us. I don't know how many there were. My guess is that we were maybe 50 or 60 kids, or maybe more. And we were there. And eventually the Swiss let us out, let us go out. And I found some of the kids had been taken care of by, the ones who had managed to go into Switzerland were again being taken care of by the Jewish organization, OSE, that I was talking about. And they were in Geneva. So I managed to get the Swiss to let me go to Geneva. And that's where the end of the war was. I stayed there till the end of the war.
And when the war ended, and it's truly, I mean, the story is incredible because remember, as all these young people, teenagers are listening, you were only a child yourself, starting from 10 until 15, surviving really with help, but on your own. So can you tell us at the end of the war, how you find out what happens with your parents and your brother?
What we did was there was no way to find out. I mean, Europe was in total chaos. There was no mail service. There were no nothing. One day, I received a letter from a captain, U.S. Army Captain Stern, addressed to me in my place in the home, in the large house in Geneva, where I was with the other kids taken care of by OSE. And the letter was from my brother. He had found me, and through the Jewish organizations were exchanging names because everybody was looking for everybody. And so we arranged to meet as soon as possible. My brother and I, he had survived, and we arranged to meet as soon as possible. I could not go into Austria because it was occupied by four. There were 4 zones of occupation. There was the American, English, French, and maybe only 3. I don't know. And he could not come to Switzerland because the Swiss wouldn't let him in. So we met on the border. We arranged to meet at the border, and on the border post. And I have a stack about 1 inch thick that was given to me by the Holocaust Museum in Washington. That was the correspondence between various people to get me permission to go to the Swiss border and to meet my brother there. But anyway, I met my brother. He had survived. He had been in a camp and he had escaped. And of course, I asked him what had happened to our parents, and he said, unfortunately, in fact, he knew the date on which they were taken. And we just had the outside this month in March, on the 16th of March, 1942, they were taken. And they were murdered in Belzec, B-E-L-Z-E-C. It was an experimental killing center because this was before Auschwitz was even built. And they were killed there. And my first question to him when we met was, are you absolutely sure that our parents are dead? And he said, unfortunately, yes, I'm sure. And he asked me whether I had any photographs of my parents. And I told you how I'd I'd torn up the letters, but saved the photographs. And I showed him the photographs. And it was wonderful to meet him. Okay.
You were so fortunate to find him and to have those pictures, even though your parents did not survive. You were so fortunate to be able to find your brother.
Yeah. And then he told me toward the end of our meeting, he told me that he had gotten married in the meantime. And so we arranged for another meeting at the border. And I asked him to bring his wife, which he did. So I met my sister-in-law for the first time. She was from Vienna. She was a Jew from Vienna who had also been deported and had managed to survive. In fact, they were together. They met during the bad period and hid together.
So in the interest of time, because it's almost 7:30, just a few more things. How did you and your brother and your sister-in-law now come to the United States?
Well, I have an uncle in Brooklyn, and he arranged for me to get the papers, to so-called affidavit, which you needed in those days to come to America. And I came legally. I still have my passport, and is a stamp, admitted permanent to the United States. So I came legally on the 7th of July, 1946. I was 17 years old, and I immediately started school. I mean, I came in July and September. I started school to catch up on all the schooling that had been interrupted.
And what do you believe we can do today to fight hatred and anti-Semitism?
I think the situations are not comparable. You see, the Jews were totally powerless during the period when I was there. In America, the Jews have a lot of influence, and they're elected. We have people in Congress who are Jewish. Any anti-Semitism, unfortunately, there's a revival of it, should not be tolerated and should be fought with every conceivable means. And survivors say never again, and we need it. We need it, and we mean it.
Yes, and thankfully that's why we're all sitting here today, so that we can remember to say that and share your story as well. Somebody else is asking if you were ever able to go back with your children or your family and visit Germany and where you were from and your home.
Excellent question. I didn't tell you, I continued my education in America. I have a doctorate in chemistry, and I became a quite well-known chemist in my field. And I was very active in international affairs, meaning joint meetings with other countries. But I absolutely refused to go to Germany. But after 45 years, I figured that all of the murderers are dead by now. I waited 45 years after I had left. The murderers are dead now, and it's okay to get back. What happened was that I received an invitation. I was on sabbatical in France, in Strasbourg, which is right on the German border. And I received the professors at the University of Freiburg, which is not far away, which is a couple of hours drive away from where I was, found out I was there, and they invited me to come and visit them and give a lecture there. Well, that was a very difficult decision for me, but finally I did it. I decided to go, because they were not the people who had caused all the problem. In fact, the measurement that I used, anybody older than I want nothing to do with. Anybody younger cannot be held, my age or younger cannot be held responsible, cannot hold today's Germans responsible for the murders that were committed then. So I finally went to Germany. And after I'd been to Germany, I decided, well, I might as well go to Berlin and see what happens. And I drove, I had I had a car and I drove to Berlin. And because I was working for the US government, I had special permission to go through the Russian zone. You had to go through the Russian zone from the west to get to Berlin. But I finally went back to Berlin, and I found our place. And then amazingly, it was right next to the airport. You'd think that it would have been destroyed. Berlin was heavily destroyed, but our house still stood there. And I went in, it looked the same. I went up the staircase to our floor. I didn't want to go into the apartment, but I did. But I went up there, and on the way up, I found that the staircase creaked at one point. And I remembered as a kid, I was standing there all day long making this screechy noise. So that was sort of interesting to go back to my place. I went to school. And it interestingly enough, it had the flags of all the countries from which they had students in my school, my previous school, from which I didn't spell,
Right, where you went.
including the Israeli flag, So these were different times, clearly.
Yes.
Eventually, I took my whole family, my children, my grandchildren, to Berlin, and I showed them where I lived. And when they found out that I was there, my school invited me to talk to the students, and I told them my story in German, which my son-in-law was sitting in the back of the room, and my family was sitting in the back of the room behind the students, and they said, "We didn't know you could speak." No. He said, "Oh, that was a good story." Besides, I didn't know you could understand German. He said, "I don't understand German, but your German, I understood."
So we're able to. So for one last question, somebody is asking, how did the Holocaust and your experiences affect your Jewish faith?
My Jewish what?
Like how your belief in Judaism or being Jewish, how did it affect you?
Well, we belong to a synagogue here. We're not fervent goers to synagogues, but I do believe in being a member of a Jewish community, because unlike in Germany or in France, I don't have to hide it, and I can be proudly here. And so we are Jews. We belong. My grandson, my youngest grandson, was bar mitzvah last year, and he had a wonderful bar mitzvah, in which he, by the way, told my story.
How special.
You're good.
Mazel tov.
And so, no, we're Jews. We're not really observant Jews, and we don't. For example, we don't have a kosher house. So.
Thank you so much. I know how honored everybody was to hear your story today, and I hope that for years and years to come, we can hear you sharing your story. With that, I want to introduce Terry Friedman, the chair of the Center for Volunteerism, to conclude our program.
Norbert, I was very moved by hearing your stories, and I wanted to tell you, because I looked up your bio, my parents went to City College and were chemistry majors, probably 10 years ahead of, but my father actually had a PhD in chemistry. So
Also,
outside of all of what we heard today, I appreciate that. It was really moving to hear your story, and the most important thing we can all do to honor you is to continue to tell your story to others. And especially that we have a teen group here today. I encourage everyone to share something about what you learned today on your social media platforms, and use the hashtags Never Forget Is Now and IMGMW, because we are all responsible for continuing to tell the story, whether we're the descendants of survivors or just because we're Jews and caring people. And it's really a responsibility we should all take on. We also would love for you to pick up the phone or see someone socially distant and share what you learned today about Norbert and his story. You can even share that he was a chemist, whatever it is you want to share, but help us perpetuate the story so that we can double the impact of the number of people immediately who know his story. And after the Passover holiday, we will be observing Yom HaShoah. We hope you will join us for a virtual community-wide commemoration on April 7th at 7 p.m. And on behalf of everyone here today, I want to thank you for joining us, especially teens, to take time out of your weekend. And we look forward to hearing how you've shared your stories that you heard today and seeing you at other community programming in the future.